Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today we are going to be going over the 15 years or so after the Civil War, known as the Reconstruction Era. Today's learning targets: let's explore how Congress and the presidents clashed over Reconstruction. We're going to describe the impact of Reconstruction on the South, what it made it look like, and we'll explain how Reconstruction finally came to an end. So let's get started. After the Civil War, the era is known as Reconstruction because we are bringing the South back into the Union. This problem of how to reconstruct the Union in the wake of the South's military defeat was one of the most difficult challenges ever faced by American policymakers. The Constitution has no guidelines because our founding fathers probably did not anticipate any division of the country. This debate evolved into a major political crisis. There are people who want a minimal Reconstruction policy, who want a quick restoration of the Union and no protection of freed slaves beyond the abolishment of slavery. There are people who want a more radical policy and want readmission of the southern states to be dependent on guarantees that loyal men would displace the Confederate elite in positions of power, and that blacks would acquire basic rights of American citizenship. The White House and Lincoln, along with his successor, Johnson, favor the minimalist approach. Congress is more radical, and they want a more thoroughgoing form of Reconstruction. This struggle between Congress and the president is the most serious clash between the two branches of government in our history, so much so that it leads to the impeachment of a president. But during the war, Lincoln knows he's going to have to address Reconstruction at some point, and one of the first things he does is pass the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a federal agency placed in the South in different offices that it's designed to assist newly freed slaves. This agency only lasts a few years, from about 1865 to 1869 or 1870 is when it's fully phased out. Here you can see a map of the circles are where the Freedmen's Bureaus are located in the South. You can see there are some states without them: Arkansas, Texas, and Florida. Most have them, and then this map also looks at colleges established during the Reconstruction era, black colleges to educate these former slaves. And you can see the only ones established before the Civil War are north in Chicago and Detroit area, Pennsylvania. Lincoln did not have the time to set forth a final post-war Reconstruction policy. He was doing things during the war, but he was assassinated before he could do a final post-war policy. His earlier policies indicate he would have been lenient on the South, because one thing he does is he passes the 10% plan, which means that once 10% of the voting population in the southern states had taken a loyalty oath, they would then be allowed to set up a loyal government and be readmitted to the Union. That would be a very lenient policy toward the South. Unfortunately, just days after Lee surrenders and the Civil War ends, Lincoln is shot in the back of the head at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. He was seeing a play there, Our American Cousin. He is rushed next door, and he dies the next morning. His assassinator was John Wilkes Booth, and at that point, Vice President Andrew Johnson becomes the new president, and he will be in charge of putting our country back together. Here are some major acts. I wanted to throw this in there. It's a great little chart. Major acts of the Reconstruction era, like the Freedmen's Bureau, the Civil Rights Act, the Reconstruction Act that divides the former Confederacy into military districts, the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to anybody who is in the United States. We'll talk about that later, or born in the United States. The 15th Amendment also extends voting rights to black African American males. Johnson's plan is also easy on the South. Johnson allows the South to join the Union again once they do the allegiance oaths to the United States and once they accept the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that ends slavery in 1865. They also had to ratify that. And in return, Johnson would uphold and protect states' rights. However, Congress was not very happy with this. They wanted a more strict approach to letting the South back in Union. They wanted it to be very harsh on them since they were the ones who started the war. These are called the Radical Republicans, and they gain a 2/3 majority of Congress in 1866, and that 2/3 majority is important because that is what you need to override the president's veto. So essentially, they can do what they want now. They argue that since the South caused the war, they should be punished more harshly. They want southern states to be subordinate to federal power, and they want instituted full citizens' rights for African Americans. Now, it's not that the Radical Republicans believe that blacks are equal to whites. They don't believe that. They just don't believe in slavery. They did believe, however, that in a modern democracy, all citizens must have the same basic rights and opportunities regardless of their national or natural abilities. Now, this puts the Radical Republicans in Congress at odds with Johnson, and eventually Johnson starts dismissing people from his cabinet who have been loyal to the Confederacy and who sympathize with radical Reconstruction. Now Congress is upset, and they start to make laws saying that Johnson cannot remove anybody from office who was put there by the Senate. It's called the Tenure of Office Act. And apparently Johnson did dismiss somebody who was put there with approval by the Senate, and so he was in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, and they overwhelmingly impeached the president in 1868, and he's placed on trial before the Senate. Impeachment doesn't necessarily mean throwing somebody out of office. It means bringing charges against an official. He does miss the one vote needed, or he misses the 2/3 majority needed to throw him out of office by one vote, and so he gets to stay in. Once the radicals take over, and here's the beginning of number 2, Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant is elected president, and he and the radicals divide the South into 5 military districts, which there was a map at the beginning of the video. They also pass the 14th Amendment, which guarantees full citizenship status to every person born in the United States, even ex-slaves. And also, all persons were to be treated equal under the law. Equal was not a part of the original Constitution because of the slave issue. Now it is. All citizens have equal rights under the law. And according to the Radical Republicans, to be readmitted to the Union, states must grant voting rights to black men. And they eventually will with the 15th Amendment. So to review, here are the 3 plans to rebuild the Union. Lincoln wanted to be very easy on them. Johnson wanted to be easy on them, but had a few more restrictions. And the Radical Republicans were very harsh on the South. So if you have those 3 plans down, you'll be good. Blacks during this time rebuild their lives. Blacks come to the polls in droves. A lot of whites stay away because of various reasons. Some of them are banned because they were leaders in the Confederacy. Others just move away. So the blacks have the overwhelming majority, and southern states start electing black officials and strong Republican Party representation. And they pass the 15th Amendment, which is that all males can vote regardless of color or previous servitude, which means former slaves. Blacks build their own churches, their own communities. You can see earlier they set up colleges, and they even got married. A lot of blacks did become sharecroppers, though. And this landowner, here's how sharecropping works. The landowner provides everything to a sharecropper, usually a black man or a black family, in exchange for a large share of the harvested crop, usually 50%. The sharecropper then purchases supplies from the landowner's store on credit at high interest rates because they don't have any money, and they won't get any money until they sell part of their crop. The sharecropper then plants and harvests the crop. The landowner sells the crop and takes the predetermined share, which is 50%. The sharecropper's portion of the crop is usually worth less than the amount owed on credit to the landowner. And afterwards, it becomes a cycle of poverty. So the sharecropper must promise the landowner a larger share of the next year's crop, and then is trapped in this cycle of debt. And this became much worse after very poor crops in the 1866 and 1867, but this is usually the way it was in the 1870s, and this becomes a newer form of servitude for newly freed blacks. The Ku Klux Klan was formed, an early version of it during this time. These are Southerners who are forming secret societies and using terror tactics to scare blacks and their white supporters. Congress passed laws preventing this, but still a lot of blacks stay away from the polls because they're being intimidated. Then number 3, learning target 3, the end of Reconstruction is signaled by the election of 1876. And in the election of 1876, Samuel Tilden wins the popular vote over Rutherford B. Hayes, but the Electoral College once again is in dispute. And these disputed votes are in states with radical Republican governments. So the compromise for these radical Republican governments is Hayes can be the winner if he promises to pull all of the federal troops from the South, because they were divided into military districts. And that is what happened. Hayes does become president, and he does pull all the federal troops from the South, and that is the end of Reconstruction. This is known as the Compromise of 1877. And so Hayes takes the oath of office, and he immediately orders the Army not to resist a democratic takeover of state governments in the South. And the last of the radical governments fell, and the entire South was now firmly under the control of white Democrats, because they are not in favor of the Republicans who are against slavery. So here are some other effects broken down for African Americans, women's suffrage, and state and national parties. For African Americans, they can now vote and own lands. They have a choice of where to work. Some of them reunited with their family. The 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments give them rights that they never had before, and we start educating African Americans. Women's suffrage was fragmented because they got the right to vote for black men, but they did not get the right to vote at all. The disagreement over the 15th Amendment, including a clause allowing women the right to vote, but in 1869, states begin awarding the right to vote to women, first of which being Wyoming Territory. And effects at the state and national parties, white Southerners shunned the Republican Party, and African Americans embraced it. And the Democratic Party rules the white South. The Republican Party becomes the party of big business after this, and that'll play into our chapters coming up. And the National Democratic Party is different from the Southern Democrats, and so they have to maintain a balance, and it becomes difficult in the years ahead. Finally, this political scandal in the Grant administration, they start to withdraw troops from the South. It's the end of Reconstruction. And the effects of Reconstruction, again, listed another way. The Union is restored, African Americans gain rights, the Southern economy and infrastructure are improved, and we'll get into that next chapter as well. Some Southern states establish a public school system. The Ku Klux Klan and other groups like them become a part of everyday life in the South and terrorize African Americans. And the sharecropping system, unfortunately, becomes a way of employment for poor whites and lots of African Americans. And that is our lesson for today. Be ready for the test coming up, and if you have any questions, tweet them at me.